Senator McBride.
Mr. President, thank you. At this time, we'd like to go back on the agenda, and I yield to Senator Peterson for the purpose of considering legislation.
Senator Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move Senate Bill 19 for its third and final reading by title only for consideration by the Senate.
Madam Reading Clerk, for purposes of consideration by the Senate, could you please read Senate Bill number 19 by title only?
Senate Bill number 19, sponsored by Senator Peterson, Representative Scott, and many others. An act to amend Title 11 of the Delaware Code relating to the death penalty. Mr. President, that completes the reading of Senate Bill number 19 by title only.
Senate Bill number 19 is before the Senate. Senator Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Senate Bill 19 seeks to abolish the Delaware's death penalty, replacing it with life without parole. I move for the introduction of Senate Amendment number 1.
Madam Reading Clerk, for purpose of consideration by the Senate, could you please read Senate Amendment 1 by title only?
Senate Amendment number 1 to Senate Bill number 19, sponsored by Senator Peterson and Senator Marshall. Mr. President, that completes the reading of Senate Amendment number 1 to Senate Bill number 19 by title only.
Senate Amendment number 1 is before the Senate. Senator Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senate Amendment number 1 removes Section B from the bill, which is the section that talks about the people who are already on death row. It removes them from coverage of the bill. Any comments or questions? They're handing it out. Take a moment so people can have a chance to look at it.
Senators had an opportunity to look at the amendment. Senator Lavelle.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm going to reserve some comments for the entire bill.
Senator Peters.
Mr. President, I ask for a roll call on Senate Amendment number 1, please.
Secretary, could you please call the roll on Senate Amendment number 1 to Senate Bill 19?
Senator Blevins. Yes. Senator Benini. Absent. Senator Bushweller. Senator Bushweller. Yes. Senator Cloutier. Yes. Senator Ennis. Yes. Senator Hollong.
Yes.
Yes. Senator Henry.
Yes.
Yes. Senator Hocker. Yes. Senator Lavelle. Yes. Senator Lawson. Yes. Senator Lopez. Yes. Senator Marshall. Yes. Senator McBride. Yes. Senator McDowell. Not voting. Senator Peterson.
Yes.
Yes. Senator Pettyjohn. Yes. Senator Poore. Yes. Senator Simpson. Yes. Senator Sokola. Yes. Senator Townsend. Yes. Senator Venables. Yes. President, the roll call on Senate Amendment number 1 to Senate Bill number 19. 19 yes, 1 not voting, and 1 absent.
Having received its required majority vote, Senate Amendment number 1 is passed the Senate and is part of the bill. Senator Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to hold my comments for later in the debate and begin with 3 witnesses, please. If I may, I request first the privilege of the floor for Mr. Kirk Bloodsworth.
Privilege of the floor has been requested. Without objection, if you could come forward, sir. And please identify yourself.
My name is Kirk Noble Bloodsworth. I'm the Advocacy Director for Witness to Innocence. Mr. President, distinguished members of the Senate, Senators all, I am here to urge you to repeal the death penalty in Delaware for one simple reason. Human beings are not perfect. No one knows this better than me. An honorably discharged Marine who served my country as a military police officer. I had no criminal record and found myself on Maryland's death row for a crime I did not commit. I'm from Cambridge, Maryland. I grew up in Dorchester County, Maryland, where I was a waterman, a crab fisherman. My father was a fisherman, his father, and so forth. I came of age working with my father as a waterman on the Chesapeake. We sold a lot of crabs and did a lot of work through Seaford, Delaware, and Bethlehem Beach and Dewey. I went across the Lewis Delaware Ferry in 1969, one of the first times. My dad and I have been going across there for years. Delaware has always been a friend to me and my family. 28 years ago, this very month, just a few days passed, I sat in a courtroom and witness after witness looked at me in the eye and said I was the one they saw that day in this terrible murder happened. See, my other distinction is being the advocacy director for witness innocence. I'm the first death row inmate in the United States to be freed by DNA testing. The state's attorney called me a monster. The jury convicted and sentenced me to death, to cheers in the courtroom. I was humiliated, and the weight of being convicted for a crime I did not commit laid heavy on my shoulders. I'd like to tell the chamber that I sat there, and every single person pointed me in the face, told me I was a killer. Never been arrested for anything in my life. And let me just tell you what they accused me of. I was accused of one of the most brutal murders in the state's history in Maryland. A 9-year-old little girl by the name of Dawn Venice Hamilton. She was found brutally murdered in a wooded area near her home in 1984 in the summer of that year. And when I say brutal, distinguished members of this Senate, I mean brutal. One of the most brutal crimes. And just briefly, I'm going to say her head was crushed. Her throat was stepped on with so much force the imprint of the sneaker embedded in her skin. She was viciously attacked, sexually assaulted, and brutalized. That is what this honorably discharged Marine with no criminal record was charged with. And they were seeking the death penalty in my case. I told anyone and everyone from the moment I was arrested till the moment I was released, I was an innocent man. I used to sign my correspondence that way. Respectively submitted Kirk Noble Bloodsworth, A period, I period, M period, an innocent man. In my case, I cannot blame corner cutting. The late Ann Brokes, the prosecutor in my case, was very smart, one of the smartest prosecutors in the state of Maryland. She was appointed a judge before she just passed away just a few months ago. The judges in both trials were very smart. The homicide detective, over 25, 30 years of service as a homicide detective, very smart. The jury was very smart. 2 juries was very smart and very concerned citizens. But in the end, every single person in my case, was dead wrong. I am alive despite my wrongful conviction. I know that you care about wrongful convictions in the state of Delaware, and all the people in this chamber and in this, everyone I have come across is very concerned with what happened to me and been very respectful since the day I walked in this building. I respect Delaware's legal system, but in the end, the system is run by human beings. That an innocent person in Delaware could be sentenced to death and executed. The National Academy of Science recently found that the states of forensics in the United States is abysmal. Scientific tools are only as good as the people using them, and we already know, even at best, most well-intentioned can make mistakes. Crime labs across the country regularly make mistakes in DNA recovery and analysis. Indeed, 27% of all wrongful convictions exposed by DNA technology, false confessions, and perjury. A 2005 study of over 340 wrongful convictions across the country showed that perjury was the most common contributing factor in murder cases. Perjury committed by jailhouse informants, co-defendants, state forensics experts, police, and even the defendant himself. What reform can eliminate such failure? a system run by human beings, just can't be foolproof. And I know that you don't have any people at the moment that you know that are innocent, but the day will come. It can't be foolproof, and at the end of the day, it's a catch-22. The more we try to prevent wrongful convictions and errors, the longer and more painful we make the process for victims' family members. This is an untenable conflict, and we can't have it both ways. I recently started a new position as an advocacy director for Witness to Innocence, a national organization run by men and women who have been exonerated on death row. We have 142 in this country that have been exonerated. Delaware is not added to that list, and I do not want you to be added to that list. Who have been exonerated from death row. We share similar misfortunes, but they all occur for different reasons. Sometimes people make mistakes. Sometimes people lie. Sometimes we think we know more than we do. Delaware can't afford to be wrong. We can't afford to do what it does to victims' family members. We can't afford the racial bias of the death penalty. And we can't afford the greatest risk of all, the execution of an innocent person. And I would hate to stand here one day and have that happen, and we're all talking about it at that point. There's a friend of mine who is one of the former chair members of the Witness to Innocence. He was the chairman of the board, and he said it quite uniquely. His name is Freddie Pitts. He's one of the first people to be exonerated in the state of Florida. And his comment was, you can free an innocent man from prison, but you cannot free him from the grave. We can't afford that greatest risk of executing an innocent person. This is a check this legislature of Delaware can't cash. Support repeal of the death penalty in Delaware, because if it can happen to me, it can happen to anyone. And sooner or later, it will happen in the state of Delaware. Thank you very much. Any questions?
Senator Peterson.
If there are no questions, Mr. President, I ask that the witness be excused.
Witness is excused. Thank you.
I thank you, Mr. Bloodsworth, for being here today and last week as well, and for the good work that you do. Thank you.
Senator Peterson.
Next witness I'd like to call is Kristen Freilich.
Without objection, if you please come forward. Please identify yourself to the Senate.
Kristen Freilich. Thank you, Senator Peterson. Thank you. My name's Kristen Freilich. I'm here as the current president of Delaware Citizens Opposed to the Death Penalty, but more importantly, I'm here to speak to you as the sister of a murder victim. I'm going to tell you some things I've learned about the death penalty in the 18 years since my brother David and 4 of his friends were murdered in Connecticut. We are all led to believe that after a murder, a death sentence and an execution will balance the scales and heal our pain. I'm here to tell you that it doesn't work that way. I hear people say the death penalty is for the victims. I hear them say the death penalty will provide closure. I hear them say the death penalty is for the worst of the worst. I have found all those statements to be false. In the case of my brother's murder, it was certainly a case that fit the worst of the worst. 5 young men in their 20s, brutally gunned down and their bodies burned. David was 22 years old. First time living on his own with friends. He was a sweet young man. My family adopted him when he was a toddler. He had birth defects and wore an artificial leg, but it never stopped him from doing anything he wanted. He joined the Boy Scouts. He hiked and swam. He was friendly and outgoing. After the murder, even with his partial leg, it took dental records to identify his body. The prosecutors sought the death penalty. They said it was the right thing to do. But they never asked us. They never asked the family members. At a time when we already felt powerless, the legal process took away even more of our control by assuming it knew what we wanted and needed. Many of us did not want the death penalty. Because it was a death penalty case, even with the killer in custody, it took 3 years to come to trial. It was a terrible time, trying to live each day under that terrible burden of grief. The focus on the killer and the details of the murders were torture. The uncertainty was torture. I called the prosecutor's office in distress because there was so little information about what was going on. The answer was, everything takes longer because it's a death penalty case. I felt like my life was on hold. The trial finally began and the media coverage escalated. At some point during the trial, prosecutors suddenly dropped the death penalty. They didn't think they could guarantee a conviction under death penalty restrictions. The death penalty, which we had been told was so important, was suddenly gone. The killer was sentenced to life without parole. I knew then that the death penalty was a false promise and that the legal process was separate from the grieving and healing process I needed to go through. Last year, during the successful campaign to repeal Connecticut's death penalty, I joined 180 other murder victim family members to support repeal. All of us had learned through painful experiences that the death penalty harms victims' family members. Longer investigations, longer trials, years of appeals, all can re-traumatize families, forcing us to relive the crime over and over in the courts and the media, keeping the focus on the murderer, and postponing necessary grieving and healing. I have grown to despise the word closure because it doesn't fit with anything I know. For me, grieving and healing are lifelong, and the death penalty was never a way to complete either. In Delaware, as in Connecticut, the death penalty is not a reliable outcome after a murder. Leading family members to pin their hopes on this false promise is cruel. Cornell Law School's recent independent study on the application of Delaware's death penalty found that more than a third of all individuals sentenced to death in Delaware from 1977 through August 2012 eventually were resentenced to life imprisonment. So more than a third of the time, the death penalty was a false promise. I hear people say the death penalty provides justice. I reject that. Is there any way that the execution of their killer could make up for the loss of my brother and his friends and the damage done to our community? No. His execution could never have balanced the scales. Even when a killer is executed, the victim's family still has to mourn their loved one. Only now, the family of the killer is grieving too. The scales aren't balanced, the wounds aren't healed, the violence and the devastation continue, and we're no closer to preventing more murders. We have to decide what we value and put our limited resources toward those things. I value accountability. I am satisfied that a sentence of life without parole provides accountability. If we value murder victims, then we will find other ways to honor their lives. I reject the notion of tying the value of a murder victim's life to the fate of his or her killer. The value of my brother's life is immense because he was a human being and he was and is loved. The value of his life does not become less because his killer did not receive a death sentence. If we value victims' family members, then we will ask them what they need instead of assuming that all we want is revenge. The death penalty distracts us from responding to some of the most pressing needs, including counseling, restitution, medical expense reimbursement, housing and job assistance, assistance with funeral expenses, and scholarships for dependents. If we value police officer safety, we will put resources into proper equipment, proper staffing, and proper training. If we value public safety, then we will put our resources into preventing more murders rather than waste them on this costly and ineffective public policy. Thank you.
Senator Peterson.
There are no questions. I ask the witness be excused.
Witness is excused.
Thank you, Ms. Freilich, for all the work that you do. I'd like to call Mr. Stuart Gotts.
Privilege of the floor has been requested. Without objection, if you please come forward and identify yourself for the Senate.
My name is Stuart Gotts of Newark, Delaware. Thank you for inviting me to speak with you today. Thank you for honoring me with your attention today. And especially thank you for the mutual respect that everyone has shown today for all of everyone's individual perspective. As I said, my name is Stuart Gotts. I'm 59 years old, and I've lived in Newark since 1990. I have had several rewarding yet distinctive careers. I worked in the chemical sales, paper manufacturing, and I'm currently nearing the end of my third career as a high school chemistry teacher. I have voted for both Republicans and Democrats. I am a father, a wrestling coach, and an ultramarathon runner. I'm also a strong supporter for ending the death penalty in Delaware. Given my diverse background, I trust you will not be the least bit surprised that my reasons for supporting abolition are somewhat unique. I am not a liberal, nor am I a conservative. I represent many, perhaps most of your constituents. I seek a measured middle road to solving our political and social challenges. When it comes to our criminal justice system, I believe that criminals who receive a fair trial and are found guilty by a jury of their peers deserve to be punished as the law prescribes. I believe in the law. I also believe that our current law punishes far more than just the guilty, and that is why I'm asking you to end the death penalty. I have not always held these beliefs. Like many of you, I believe that our society's worst criminals deserve the ultimate punishment. I believe that the death penalty was appropriate because it would deter future crimes and minimize the expense of lifetime incarceration. I even believe that the death penalty was fairly applied and mistakes were either few or subsequently corrected through the appellate process. Then one day I received a summons to appear for jury service. Shortly after reporting to the courthouse, I was one of 15 jurors selected for the capital murder trial of James Cook. It was exciting. It was the most unique event of my life, and although I did not then know it, it was the end of my naivete concerning our criminal justice system. My fellow jurors were a desirable cross-section of our society. I'm a teacher. There was an accountant, a lawyer, an elementary school teacher, various office workers, union members, men and women, young and old, black and white. We were just regular folks. Then the trial started. Opening statements focused us on our task. We were to determine the facts of the case, render a verdict, and ultimately decide whether Mr. Cook should die for his crime. Of course, as with all other jurors, we were given detailed instructions. We could not read about the case, watch the news, listen to radio accounts, or discuss the case with anyone, even our fellow jurors. We were essentially instructed to shut off all communications with the rest of the world. We sat for hours each day contemplating and analyzing the murder of Lindsay Bonasol. We sat for hours each day contemplating and analyzing the childhood, the social development, and the ultimate destruction of a child who turned into a murderer. Fine, regular people, your friends and neighbors, set about to do the job that society set before them. We were the jury. 12 regular, untrained citizens assumed the sole burden of determining whether or not James Cook would die for this crime. That is, your child's kindergarten teacher, your dentist, the accountant next door, your grandma, your 19-year-old daughter, and other regular folks were asked to immerse themselves for weeks in the details of violent murder, to experience sleepless nights, rehashing testimony, and not talk of it, all the while isolated from a normal life. And then, when we were completely immersed in this emotional hell, we were required to swiftly decide whether we should kill this man before us. Amidst all this turmoil, we, the jury, responded, "We will kill him if you say so." And thus we did. And thus I became a killer too. It was legal. It was my duty. And I do not feel personal guilt, but I became sick. For days I was unable to joke with friends or sleep at night. For weeks, I was unable to stop reliving that singular moment when I wrote death on a tiny slip of paper. For months, I awoke every night from unrelenting and vivid dreams of James Cook's yet-to-occur execution. I followed and still follow every element of Cook's appeal. I will never be the same. And even though I know that I did nothing wrong, I will always carry the stain of one who has killed a fellow human being. Unfortunately, the jury is not the only group punished in a capital trial. We demand our prosecutors to work hard to carry out justice with singular attention to killing another human being. Equally, the defense team carries a heavy burden. The smallest error on their part will result in their client's death. Witnesses and victims are forced to relive one of the most horrific moments of their lives. What is more, they must suffer this emotional trauma for years into the future, throughout every appeal in both state and federal courts, all because, as a society, we want to kill criminals. In other words, the lives of dozens of regular folks will be centered not just on examining the awful facts of a criminal case, that has to be done, but on the premeditated and deliberate yet avoidable killing of another human. As a society, we must punish people for their crimes. We must protect our children from violent offenders. Life without the possibility of parole accomplishes these goals without turning innocent folks into accomplices to the premeditated murder of an individual. I submit that those with no personal experience in this process fail to recognize the inconceivable burden we place on innocent participants in capital trials. I submit that the real harm we do to our innocent grandmas, our children, neighbors, and public servants outweighs any potential benefit that society might derive from the vengeful killing of criminals. The calculus of killing a criminal in exchange for the emotional and mental well-being of numerous blameless citizens of society at large is flawed. So let's end capital punishment. Not for the criminal, but for ourselves. Let's just stop. Thank you.
Senator Peterson.
Mr. President, I ask that the witness be excused. Thank you, Mr. Dotz.
Witness is excused.
At this time, Mr. President, I'll yield to my colleagues I understand there are other witnesses some folks would like to call.
Senator Lavelle.
Thank you, Mr. President. If I may, I'd like to approach the podium. I have a statement that I'd like to read on behalf of a family, and then come back and ask a couple questions as my role as senator.
Without objection.
Thank you, sir. I'd like to read a statement that was sent to me. I'm reading on behalf of the family of Mark and Kathleen Bonestall, Lindsay Bonestall's parents. They're unable to make it today due to distance and some other family issues. Lindsay Marie Bonestall was a 20-year-old sophomore journalism major at the University of Delaware. During the early hours of May 1, 2005, Lindsay was the victim of a violent crime that took her life. Lindsay was beaten, bound, and gagged so tightly that it ripped her mouth on either side. She was viciously raped before her assailant knelt on her chest and strangled her to death. Her killer poured bleach on her in an attempt to destroy his DNA. He dragged Lindsay to the bathroom, dumped her in the tub, piled her with debris, and set her lifeless body ablaze. The fire, which endangered the lives of all residents of Town Court Apartments in Newark, initially hid the gruesome crime scene. Upon discovery, Lindsay's body was burned beyond recognition, and her parents and family were never able to say goodbye. Lindsay was a beautiful, warm, fun-loving person with a lively spirit and zest for life. She possessed many gifts, especially in the arts and music. She enjoyed athletics, was a talented writer, and had a great sense of humor. She was a real people person, and her presence was warm and engaging. After a fun night with her girlfriends watching Saturday Night Live, Lindsay had gone home in order to get ready for work on Sunday. Lindsay did not know the name of the man who savagely raped and killed her, but it was proven during 2 trials in the Delaware Superior Courts that his name is James Cook, a current inmate on death row. The first murder trial began in the spring of 2007 in Delaware Superior Court. The DNA evidence proved that Cook had raped Lindsay. The odds that the DNA evidence belonged to anyone other than Cook were 1 in 676 quintillion, which is greater than the total number of people that have ever lived on this earth. Throughout the judicial proceedings, Lindsay's killer continuously proved that he had no remorse and no respect for the law. He had many outbursts, showed blatant disregard for the judge and jury, and frequently disrupted the proceedings with bizarre courtroom antics. He berated the judge, jury, and prosecutors while maligning Lindsay's character through his lies and delusional renditions of the truth. The jury found the defendant guilty in the first degree on all 11 counts, including murder, felony murder, rape, robbery, 3 counts of burglary, arson, reckless endangering, and 2 counts of misdemeanor theft. He was sentenced to death by Superior Court Judge Jerome Herlihy. This decision was later reversed by the State of Delaware Supreme Court in 2009 based on the right of a defendant to choose his own plea. The second murder trial took place in the spring of 2012 in the Newcastle County Courthouse. During the second trial, it became even more evident that Lindsay's killer had no remorse for any of his actions and continued to berate the judge, jury, witnesses, victim, and everyone else in the courtroom. He was initially granted the right to represent himself, which proved to be extraordinarily painful for the victim's family, as his defense was an assault on Lindsay's character. He continually lied in court, time and time again, about the events surrounding Lindsay's death. He concocted stories about Lindsay that were proven to be untrue by the prosecution team. He made a mockery of the judicial system during the proceedings and verbally threatened the judge and his family with bodily harm. He showed no remorse for his heinous crimes and subjected our family, the Bonistals, to agonizing pain during the proceedings by lying in court. In essence, he victimized Lindsay over and over again during the proceedings with his cruel and malicious lies, sadistic courtroom antics, and lack of remorse. Lindsay's killer displayed a sickening disregard for human life and society at large. Testimony by prison guards proved that he continued to harm others with disturbing behaviors such as masturbating in front of female guards and creating chaos amongst prisoners for the misuse of property. Cook was convicted and sentenced to death for a second time by Superior Court Judge Jerome Poliver. Words cannot describe the overwhelming amount of pain, heartache, and grief that Lindsay's family and friends have endured by her horrific death. There is nothing in the world to prepare you for the senseless, violent murder of a loved one. Nothing can prepare you for the profound impact that violent crime has on the family. How do you explain the brutalization of your child to her sibling? How do you tell grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, and friends that your loved one has been savagely and viciously raped and killed by a complete stranger? How do you bear the pain in the eyes of her family and those that loved her? How do you manage the overwhelming grief from such a loss? To honor her memory and to prevent other families from experiencing what we have endured, Peace Outside Campus, the Lindsay M. Bonistal Foundation, was established in June 2005. Our mission is to promote peaceful and safe living environments in college communities. While you are considering this legislation, we simply ask you to remember Lindsay. Her family is counting on you to do the right thing, which is to make sure her killer receives his just punishment, the death penalty, as was determined by the good people of Delaware in 2007 and 2012. We beseech you not to disregard the efforts of Lindsay's family, legal team, and law enforcement officers that have worked tirelessly over the last 8 years to prove that Lindsay was an innocent victim murdered by a dangerous, violent, and evil man. Please don't let the judicial process, our tragedy, trauma, and pain, to have been in vain. Lindsay was brutally raped and murdered by a complete stranger who shows no remorse for his actions. There is no end to the appeal process with a life sentence, and we, the victim's family, will only find peace and closure when Lindsay's killer has been duly executed by the state of Delaware, as was recommended by 2 Superior Court judges and 24 Delawareans in 2 concurrent trials. Lindsay was a resident and student at the University of Delaware at the time of her murder, and we have lived in Delaware for long periods of time over the last 8 years. We pray that you will give serious consideration to the victims, families, lawmakers, and citizens that will be impacted by your decision. Since 2005, we have received a great outpouring of support and prayers from the people of Delaware for Lindsay and our family, and we thank them for that. In memory of our beloved daughter, Lindsay Marie Bonestall, and on behalf of all the victims whose voices have been silenced by the most vicious criminals, we ask to have Cook's sentence upheld. Lindsay's killer does not deserve to live life in prison due to the brutal, vicious, and heinous nature of his crimes, and should not be entitled to escape punishment once again by the revocation of the death penalty. Please note that by granting Lindsay's killer life, you would be sentencing us to a lifetime of pain and suffering by subjecting us to the ongoing legal proceedings, prison annex, and constant torment. We have earned the right to seek justice and will only have peace when Lindsay's killer has been executed. Respectfully submitted by Mark and Kathleen Bonestall, parents of murder victim Lindsay Marie Bonestall. Thank you, Mr. President. A few more comments, if I may. Obviously, this came to us, or came to me, prior to this amendment. I did contact the Bonestall family to see if they wanted me to not read the statement, and they asked that I do read the statement. They didn't have the opportunity, which Delawareans in general may not, to contemplate this change, a significant change in policy, and then they asked that I go ahead. And they also wondered out loud, without knowing an answer, to be fair today, that if the next Lindsay Bonestall's family would like to see that killer, this killer, someone like this killer executed, they weren't ready to make that decision today. I attended the hearing last Thursday, Mr. President, and I'll just make a couple observations on that. I guess, first of all, I'll step back and say, obviously, people of good conscience can disagree on this issue, but that is a powerful statement by a family who's been through this twice, unfortunately. Not by the witnesses today, but some witnesses on Thursday made mention in comparison to the use of the death penalty in the United States and made reference to Iran, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia and some other countries that I guess carry out the death penalty. I find that offensive. I mean, we are a democracy. Those countries are not. We do not lightly put people to death. We don't execute political prisoners and people at a will. So I think that's just a terrible analogy for a significant and important issue. And some suggested that we should perhaps be more like Europe in our approach towards the death penalty. And I'll just point out that perhaps we should be careful what we ask for sometimes. In Norway, we'll remember that person, and I use that term lightly, who went out and shot, bombed, and essentially hunted down 77 people not too many years ago, many of them children. He was sentenced to the maximum prison term allowed in Norway for that crime, 21 years. So I think there's a concern that I've heard that, this today, what tomorrow, and so that does concern me. Those are just some general comments. Mr. President, if I may have the personal privilege of the floor for Steve Wood from the Attorney General's office.
Without objection, you could please come forward and identify yourself, sir.
Stephen Wood, Attorney General's office.
Thank you, Mr. Wood. I just have a couple questions for you. Does the Attorney General and his office have a position on this bill? And if they do, could you explain what it is?
Yes, I'd like to do that if I can. The Attorney General would like you all to know that he is a supporter of the death penalty in its current form. He believes that the death penalty ought to be reserved for the worst of the worst, and believes, and we think the statistics show beyond really any dispute, that the death penalty is reserved for the worst of the worst. It's rarely applied. It is judiciously applied. It is fairly applied. It is a solemn penalty, to be sure, and I can tell you as one who has prosecuted a number of death penalty cases, including the case against James Cook, I can tell you that it is a penalty which is only sought after a great deal of deliberation in our office, and in fact, Attorney General Biden himself personally approves every decision to seek or not to seek the death penalty in any case where it appears that the death penalty is a possibility.
Can you comment on, you sort of alluded to it, but maybe expand a little bit on how often it is used in Delaware and currently how it's put into practice?
Well, first the process and then the numbers. In our office, since Attorney General Biden came, every first-degree murder case in which there is a statutory aggravating circumstance, that is to say, a factor enumerated in Delaware's law that makes the death penalty a possibility, is ultimately reviewed with the recommendation of a prosecutor, first by a panel of the county prosecutors, the senior lawyers who supervise the prosecutors in each county, the head of our appellate division, our state prosecutor, and they make a recommendation to the Attorney General about whether or not the death penalty ought to be pursued, and then ultimately, after a great deal of deliberation, the Attorney General makes that decision himself. We seek it rarely. I know that sometimes other claims are made, but the cold, hard numbers are these. Over the last 5 years, there were 213 murder first-degree cases, and this information comes to us from the state's Statistical Analysis Center. We sought the death penalty in about 35% of those cases, and that means made the decision to ask for it at some point along the way. Some of those cases ultimately resolved short of the death penalty. But you can see how 5 years, 213 murder first-degree arrests, and there are only 17 people on Delaware's death row. So that stands in irrefutable testimony to the fact that the death penalty is rarely used and reserved, we think, for the worst of the worst.
So while you've sought that 30 times, what happens in those cases if we only have 17 people on death row, some of them probably sentenced more than 5 years ago?
That's right.
Is that a result of the jury not agreeing, or at some point you reduce the charges to first-degree murder?
It's a combination of all of those things. In order for a death penalty to be imposed, first, a Delaware jury has to agree unanimously that a statutory aggravating circumstance is present. In other words, the jury has to say the death penalty is a possibility, and that decision is binding on a judge, and it has to be unanimous. If the jury says that the death penalty is a possibility, that one or more statutory aggravating circumstances exists, then ultimately the jury recommends the penalty to be imposed to the judge. And in most cases, judges do not impose death sentences at the conclusion of death penalty proceedings, which again, in the Attorney General's view, is as it should be, because the death penalty should be imposed rarely and only after a searching, individualized determination as to its appropriateness in light of all of the factors about the crime, about the defendant, and about the victim. So it doesn't happen often.
Thank you, Mr. Wood. There's been some statistics put forth about the racial disparities with respect to the death penalty, and maybe these are disparities, nationwide averages, or certainly from other states. Can you comment on racial connections with respect to death penalties here in Delaware?
The Attorney General is grateful for the opportunity to answer that question. First, Senator, you mentioned the term, you in your question to me talked about national statistics. And I don't claim to be an expert on the criminal justice system of any other state. I'm not even claiming to be an expert about this one, but this is the state where I practice. And I will tell you, and I apologize if I sound prideful, but I would ask not to be judged by the actions of a prosecutor or a judge in, say, Flomaton, Alabama in 1978. If you were to ask me what the weather was going to be like in Wilmington tomorrow, and I replied by saying, I don't know, but on the same day, 18 years ago in Tulsa, Oklahoma, it rained, you'd think I was crazy. And rightly so. And the statistics about how the other states administer its death penalties, I would say, and submit, are equally unhelpful. I'm not here to tell you that other states do it right, but I can tell you what the statistics show in Delaware. It is true, sadly, that people of color, and particularly African Americans, are overrepresented in the criminal justice system in Delaware. But when you compare the racial breakdown of the inmates on death row to the racial breakdown of inmates in our criminal justice system, and especially those charged with first-degree murder, you get a different picture. According to the Statistical Analysis Center of the state of Delaware, over the last 5 years, 79% of the people arrested and charged with first-degree murder were African American. 79%. 59% of the people on our death row are African American. Now, are both of those numbers too high? Oh, absolutely, and please don't hear me saying the contrary. The point is, when you compare the racial breakdown of death row to a different racial breakdown, you should be comparing murderers to murderers, not murderers to good people. And the racial breakdown of our death row is actually slightly better than the racial breakdown of all of those arrested and charged with first-degree murder.
Thank you for that. And I would feel obliged to echo your comment. Unfortunately, that's a terrible statistic to have to report, but it is a statistic all the same. Finally, Mr. Wood, there's been testimony given on the deterrent effect or lack of a deterrent effect to the death penalty. Could you comment on that?
Thank you again. Although I haven't heard it said today, I've heard it said in the past, and it's possible that some think that there are no studies that show that the death penalty is a deterrent. And actually, that statement really constitutes a mischaracterization of the available scientific evidence. The New York Times in 2007 ran an article that attempted to summarize the research, and the New York Times pointed out that in the decade of the 2000s, about 12 studies by credible academicians at major universities concluded that the death penalty had a deterrent effect. Now, let me hasten to add, there are probably approximately as many credible studies by credible academicians that say the death penalty has no deterrent effect. So I think the real statistical jury is out. But here's what we do know. Stanford University Law Review in 1988 did a snapshot study of everybody in the United States who was serving a sentence for first-degree murder as of a particular date in 1984. 15% of the inmates had previously been convicted of homicide, released, and killed again. According to the United States Department of Justice in a 2005 study released by their Bureau of Justice Statistics, surveying now not just murderers, but people specifically on death row, about 8% of the people pending death sentences in the United States in 2005 had been convicted of homicide, released, and killed again. Here in Delaware, 3 of the people who have spent time on our death row before they committed the murder that landed them on death row, 3 of them had previously been convicted of homicide somewhere else, released, and killed again. In the 90s, I prosecuted James Allen Red Dog. And for those who believe that incarceration can keep us safe from the worst of the worst, I would ask you to consider the story of James Allen Red Dog. In 1973, he and another man shot and killed the proprietor of a pizzeria in Wolf Point, Montana. Red Dog was sent to prison. In 1978, he escaped from prison. He was out for 3 days. While he was out, he killed 2 people and kidnapped and raped a 3rd man. Red Dog was ultimately arrested and convicted of both of those murders, murders 2 and 3. He was sent back to federal prison, and incidentally, he was in federal prison because the first crime happened on an Indian reservation, and all of those crimes are federal crimes. Anyway, he went back to prison, first to Leavenworth, where he became involved in gang activities, and he was then ultimately sent to the federal prison in Marion, Illinois, which at the time was the federal government's most secure prison. It was their supermax. And while he was in Marion, Illinois, he committed murder number 5. He confessed to that murder. I hope I'm not giving offense to somebody's relative here, but after murder number 5, someone in the federal government thought it would be a good idea to put Red Dog in the witness protection program, release him on parole, and move him to Delaware. And I'm sorry, that was murder number 4. And while he was in Delaware on parole, he committed murder number 5. He murdered essentially by decapitating the son of his wife's best friend. He then found his wife's best friend, the mother of the murder victim, brought her back to the house where her son lay dead, raped her, kidnapped her, took her to Sussex County, raped her several more times before she escaped. Murders 2, 3, and 4 were all committed while James Allen Red Dog was supposed to be in prison. And the fifth murder was committed after he'd been released on parole. I mention that because you asked me about deterrence, and I don't want to sound cute, but obviously if Red Dog had been executed somewhere before murder number 5, we would have saved some lives. So obviously murderers who are executed cannot reoffend, and in that way, and maybe only that way, but perhaps others, there is a deterrent effect. And lest we think that couldn't happen here, in my time as a prosecutor, there have been 6 inmates serving life sentences who have escaped from the custody of the Delaware Correctional Center. I'm sorry. 3 from the Delaware Correctional Center and 3 from Gander Hill. So we've seen people serving life sentences, and 3 of those folks were serving sentences for murder, escape from prison. My boss, Kathleen Jennings, is here. She'll tell you about one of them later, David Dawson. He was not serving a life sentence, but while he was on escape from a prison here in Delaware, he committed a murder. Those are the statistics and the facts that the Attorney General would like to have considered. He would hasten to add that he understands that people of good conscience and goodwill will disagree about this issue. It is difficult morally, it is difficult ethically, it is difficult religiously, and we have no quarrel with those who take contrary positions so long as their positions are grounded on the facts and the statistics that are truly applicable to the issue in Delaware. And that's his main message, is please consider our death penalty law as it exists here and its application as it actually happens in Delaware.
Thank you, Mr. Wood. Thank you, Mr. President.
Other questions for the witness? Senator Lopez? No. Senator Lavelle? Witness is excused. Senator Lopez?
President, I'd like to request personal privilege of the floor to have a witness on the board, please. Mr. Stephen Lee.
Without objection, if you could please come forward, sir, and identify yourself for the Senate.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Stephen Lee. I, too, am a former Marine, honorably discharged. I went to war 3 times for this country. My sister was brutally murdered in a Walmart parking lot in 2001. The gun was put in the back of her head. The trigger was pulled, and my mother gave her a closed casket. She was 28 years old. She was killed for a $150,000 life insurance policy. My brother-in-law, her husband, did it. He's currently on death row. 2 years ago, my uncle, on his way home from work in Wilmington, another former Marine, honorably served his country in Vietnam, was the victim of an attempted carjacking. My uncle fought back and was shot and killed. I'm going to boil it down real simple. I don't care about revenge. I don't care about closure. When I grew up, I was told there would be consequences for my actions. If I run a red light, I get a ticket. If I don't pay my taxes, the federal government comes after me. And if I take a life, I give up the right to live. Plain and simple. If you kill someone, you have given up your rights to live in this world. It's not about revenge. It is simply the punishment has to fit the crime. Not life imprisonment where you can get a college degree and watch Oprah during the day and free meals are provided to you because you were too lazy to get a job in the first place. Punishment has to fit the crime. Thank you.
And Senator Ennis, do you have a question for the witness?
Question for the witness.
Witness is excused. Did you have a question, Senator Lopez?
Mr. Lee, I'd like to thank you for your testimony and for your service to our country. If there are no further questions, I'd like to have the witness be excused, Mr. President.
Witness is excused. Thank you. Senator Ennis.
Thank you, Mr. President. A number of you in the room will remember back in Kenton years ago when Kenneth Warren was executed in his own home trying to defend his family. But, Mr. President, I'd like to have personal privilege for Mr. Warren's former wife to give some brief testimony, and also a sister. The first one is Tina Ligger.
Privilege of the floor has been requested without objection. If you could please identify yourself for the Senate.
My name is Tina Leager, and I am a victim. I stand here today to ask you to vote against Senate Bill 19. In simple terms, if it's not broken, why are we trying to fix it? The death penalty is a belief. Some believe it's right, some believe it's wrong. Delaware law allowed me, with the help of the prosecution, to seek the death penalty. In the safety of my home, while having dinner with my husband and my 1-year-old son, 2 men crashed through my French door window with such force that they crashed right into my husband. They both had guns. They both shot repeatedly. They left my husband dead on the kitchen floor. I witnessed the entire thing, clutching my 1-year-old son. The prosecution sought the death penalty. The jury and the judge agreed. And 2 men of your 17 are currently now on death row. We've gone through appeals. And quite frankly, it's been a long time, and I'm really on the downside of this whole appeal process. You can't take the death penalty away. My feelings on the death penalty, again, everyone has their own belief. But until you've walked in my shoes, you probably couldn't quite understand what a victim could possibly want. Those criminals get to be put to sleep. I witnessed the violence of my husband being murdered in front of me. Those criminals have been spending time in prison and have been able to meet illegitimate children. My son, who was 1 year old, will never remember his father without his family sharing memories of him. Honestly, to me, it's not fair that they get put to sleep. But Delaware law and the justice system has provided me with a way for these criminals to pay for their crime. It's the death penalty, and that's what I expect. And as a victim, I can only imagine if someone else were sitting here in my shoes, that's what they would expect as well. Thank you.
Senator Ennis.
Any questions? If not, excuse a witness or another witness, please.
Witness is excused. Thank you.
Mr. President, I'd like to have opportunity to have Cheryl West, who was a sister of Kenneth Warren, give testimony, if I could, please.
Without objection, privilege of the floor has been extended. Could you please identify yourself?
Cheryl Vest, sister of victim Kenny Warren. Good afternoon, Mr. President, Delaware Senators, and guests. Please take a moment. Look at the person to your left and to your right. Imagine for one moment that person sitting next to you, or even better yet, you, your daughter, your son, your mother, your father, your sister, or your brother was repeatedly raped or sodomized, strangled, mutilated. Or you are sitting at the counter eating a turkey sandwich. Gunshots were fired through the back door, striking the victim 3 times. The men bust in. A struggle ensues, and the gun is point blank put at his head and killed. You're taking a walk with your 18-month-old child. 2 people approach you, want your money. You have none. They put the gun to your 18-month-old's face and shoot him while you're begging for that child or maybe grandchild's life. Three meals a day, a bed, air conditioning, heat in the summer and winter, an education, gym membership, weekly visits from family and friends, while not contributing 1 dime to our economy. never having to work another day while my family and many others go to the cemetery or to the jar of ashes to talk to their loved one. Take. How is it, do you say, that life in prison without parole is cheaper than the death penalty? Because of appeals? Well, those with life in prison without parole will be appealing their sentences and their convictions. Most not because they were innocent, but because of a technicality. Every 18 months, those monsters can petition to get parole. Judith McBride did, and she got out. Every 18 months, my family will have to go to fight to keep those monsters in jail. Closure? No. They were model citizens in prison. Well, I guess so. What worries did they have? No mortgage, no bills. They had a roof over their head and 3 meals a day. Some have committed murder and are petitioning to get out, only losing by 1 vote. How long before they are back on the streets hunting down their victims' family members? Because they left the house, they warned, call the cops, and we'll come back and kill the kid. Every 18 months, my family will have to relive those memories if those murderers are given life without parole. It is not uncommon for law enforcement officials across the U.S. to encounter criminals on the streets that have amassed 10 or more felony charges and convictions. They've been to prison 3, 4, 5 more times. 80% of our crime is committed by the same 20%. They continue to repeat vicious acts. Ralph Swan, one of the murderers, had recently been paroled from a Texas prison where he was serving time for aggravated assault and robbery. Beat his victims. He got released. What was next? Murder. When the background is examined, it is always found that these criminals have benefited from weak pleas, deals on cases, dismissals in exchange for a plea, various forms of settlements, cases based on the judicial economy, rather than the 2 things that they should be considered most: the protection of society and punishment. We are in tough economical times, and I understand that. We're looking for ways to cut costs. But are we really cutting costs? 30 years, that's give or take what these 2 guys will spend in prison, for paying for their meals, their housing, their health care, the salary and benefits of the guards that have to guard them, paying for their counsel for 30 years of asking for parole, while ignoring your taxpayers' and constituents' safety. You're going to put a person next to you and their families in more danger. Eliminating the death penalty is not the answer. So my family and I are begging you to vote no on Senate Bill 19. Thank you.
Senator Ennis.
No questions to choose a witness. And one other comment, if I may. I'd like to have a letter read in by some law enforcement agencies, and I have provided that copy to the Secretary of the Senate. This letter is submitted by the Delaware State Trooper Association, also the Fraternal Order of Police, State Lodge, the Delaware Police Chiefs Council, and the Correctional Officers Association. And I understand additional copies will be made available to each individual.
You wanted the letter read in its entirety, sir?
Yes.
Madam Reading Clerk, could you please read in the letter that Senator Ennis has provided?
March the 25th, 2013, to the honorable members of the State Senate, 411 Legislative Avenue, Dover, Delaware, 19901. Dear Senators, today you will be asked to vote on Senate Bill 19. We ask that you consider the practical outcome of this bill's passage as it relates to the law enforcement community, correctional officers, and first responders. Individually, our lives are no more important than any other. However, By the very nature of our jobs, we are put in harm's way on a daily basis. We truly represent the thin line that protects society from those who would do us harm. The argument has been made that the death penalty does not have a deterrent effect. We believe otherwise. It is impossible to quantify how many lives have been saved by an individual deterred by the prospect of losing his or her own life as a result of taking the life of another. We firmly believe that this particular factor plays an important role in providing us with a very real margin of safety as we perform our duties. We realize that the decision you are about to make is an extremely personal and emotional one. However, as you deliberate, please step back and consider those of us who are on the front lines. We need every tool that we can get to ensure that we return home safely to our loved ones following our shifts. Sincerely, signed by Lieutenant Thomas J. Bracken, President of the Delaware State Troopers Association, Staff Sergeant Fred Calhoun, President of the Fraternal Order of Police State Lodge, Chief Jeffrey Horvath, President of the Delaware Police Chiefs Council, and Jeff Klopp, President of the Correctional Officers Association of Delaware. Mr. President, that completes the reading from these officers.
Thank you. Senator Venables.
Thank you, Mr. President. This is probably the most difficult bill that I've had to vote on since I've been here. And I guess it's because of me, the way I'm made up. Maybe different than other people. I'm very sensitive to life. Believe it or not, I don't even kill mice. When I catch one in my bathtub, sunken tub, I take him out and let him go outside. The same thing with snakes that appear in my yard once in a while. I catch the snakes. My wife is scared to death of them. Put them in a sack and take them out because I don't want to kill them. And I guess where I've got the dilemma is, after reading so many letters and so many testimonies from people, that found relief, I find myself still supporting the death penalty. And I can't understand that. There's people in this room, and maybe they'll take offense to this, I hope not, that will support abortion on demand. And when I ask, this doesn't make sense to me, well, that's different. That's different. And my answer is, yeah, it's different. They haven't committed any crime. In fact, they've not drawn their first breath. They're 100% innocent. And these same people want to show mercy to someone that has created these or committed these atrocious crimes. And I think about the death penalty. I remember a case that instigated the death penalty to be reinstated. It was down in Laurel. This is how brutal it was. One of the workers for one of the farmers down there hit a man, the owner of the farm, in the head with a cement block. That wasn't enough. Then he got a shotgun and he blew his head off. That still wasn't enough. He went upstairs and raped his 70-year-old wife, then took the shotgun, blowed his head off, and then run out in the road, said he was going to kill Dave Elliott, which was a senator at that time, plus two of his sons. I think about this, that because of that, the death penalty was reinstalled here in the state of Delaware. I think about him in prison, which we didn't have a life in prison, or with that parole, or even the death sentence. He was paroled, finally, ever so often, like the lady talked about 18 months, it seemed like to me it was more than that. His family came to me to try to make sure, look, Bob, do everything you can. We can't let him out on parole. And if you remember just last year, his two granddaughters here on the floor, like they got kicked out of the Senate because they were so emotional. I think that should a person that commits these terrible crimes go to prison, be able to read books each day, and in a lot of cases probably watch television, and then get top-notch medical care after he committed such a crime. And I go even further. I think about myself about death, and I think there's a lot of people in this room that will die deaths that won't be comfortable. They will suffer with disease and some agony, and yet we're humane that we put them to sleep to the point just like anybody in here has had an operation or if they've been in an accident, that you just wonder, you count to 10, 1, 2, 3, and then you wake up and you wonder, where in the world you've been? The difference is, in this case, someone that committed crimes that I described, and one that was told to me by the Farm Marshal Sunday in my church that investigated the crime here in Dover, where a man shot his wife and had 3 children. One of the children escaped. He set the house on fire, by the way, and 2 more at the door he pushed back in. And this farm marshal that told me this story said he found them, the 2 kids, in the closet, dead, of course, from smoking. I just don't think that we should allow those type of people off. And I'm real concerned with Mr. Bloodsworth's testimony. It's a terrible, terrible thing to somebody innocent that is sentenced to go to death, and especially if it's carried out. But I think with the new technology we have, and even with the record that Delaware had, and I'm not sure that in some date past, that there hasn't been someone that was innocent that was put to death. But I think the chances of it are very slim. But as much as I respect life, I think there are cases where that those people need to be put to death. I hope I haven't offended anybody by what I've said, but all I said is what I feel inside. Thank you.
Senator Hawk.
Thank you, Mr. President. You know, coming from a district that defeated a very powerful politician because he supported the repeal of the death penalty, and that was Representative George Bunning at the time, I was very cautious and asked an awful lot of questions about the repeal today. And I talked to many policemen, both retired and active, and I can't find one there from my district that supports repealing the death penalty. And with that, a very good friend of mine told me a story when he was a state trooper. I asked him to put that story in writing. He did that. He is the campaign manager, he and his wife, Representative Ron Gray. They happened to be up here today for a luncheon for Representative Gray, and I told him we were going to be dealing with the death penalty. He happened to come in the building. I'm putting him on a spot because he really hasn't prepared anything, but I'd like to call him to the podium to tell his story, another Red Dog story. I request Frank Dorset to come to the podium, please.
Privilege of the floor has been requested. Without objection, please identify yourself, sir.
My name is Frank Dworczyk. I'm retired Pennsylvania State Police. I was on the job from 29 July 1971 until May 15th, 1998, which coincidentally was my wife and mine's 22nd anniversary when I retired. I'm here because I sent the Honorable Senator Hocker an email and also Representative Gray an email, and the title to my email was, "Death penalty could have saved a life." I'd like to take you back to 16 October 1972. And what I'm about to say is my wife, who I met in 1973, really never heard the details of this. But in 1972, I was part of a detail that served a fugitive from justice warrant on a dirtbag hotel in the city of Lancaster. And we got word that an Alfred C. Ravenel was there. Mr. Ravenel was a 3-time convicted murderer with 3 life sentences that had already escaped from the New Jersey prison system. I was a young trooper on the job. I only had a little bit over a year. And my big brother on the job, Bob Lapp, who was a criminal investigator, asked me if I'd like to tag along on this detail. And they always ask big guys to go along because we're usually the first guys through the door. We assembled, formed a plan, and this was the days before we had the personal bulletproof vest. We were wearing the old World War II lead vest. We had the opportunity to wear a lead-type helmet, but that helmet actually obscured your vision, so we did not wear it that day. So when we entered the hotel, we had the details set up, and as we were approaching Mr. Ravenel's room, Mr. Ravenel then came out of the room firing like the days of the Old West. He had 2 pistols, and he just started firing. Now, what I'm about to say transpired in about 20 seconds. It was really quick. But even to this day, I dream about this, and my wife will even tell you that there are times I'm jerking around in bed, and I'm just reliving this nightmare. Well, Mr. Ravenel came out and started shooting. When his first shot caught Bob Lapp right in the head and killed him instantly, and he went down. We started returning fire. Another shot, Priest Joe Westcott's head, just wounded him. We returned fire. We got Joe Westcott out. We got Bob Lapp out. And then we formed a plan to go back in again. When we went back in again, we found Mr. Ravenel. He was dead inside a closet. We extracted the ultimate price from him. Mr. Ravenel was a 3-time loser. He had nothing to fear. He had nothing to fear by killing another person, let alone a police officer. And what was really ironic is the day Bob Lapp was killed, Bob Lapp was on a day off. But Bob Lapp was a guy that he had a phrase like I had a phrase, if you cut me, I bleed gray. That's how much he loved the Pennsylvania State Police. After Bob was killed, there was a detail that went up to Peggy Lapp's house. And as soon as the state cars drove up, Peggy knew exactly what happened. She knew her husband was shot or dead. And she found out that her husband was dead. So Mr. Ravenel took away a father, a husband, a very good friend, and a damn good state. He left a wife and 3 children. And then after Bob passed away, we had a requiem mass for him, and I'm a former altar boy, and I served as an altar boy for his requiem mass, and that was one of the hardest things I ever done, was serve his mass. It's a day that I've never forgotten. I live it as it happened yesterday, and I apologize to my wife for never telling her this, but my philosophy about the job was I never brought the job home. If I told anything of my wife, it was usually something that funny happened during the day. I thank you for your time.
Senator Hawk.
If no questions, the witness can be excused.
Witness is excused. Thank you.
I would say that Bob Lapp would be considered an innocent man in his grave. You heard that spoken earlier today. But it was the year 2007. 3 Delaware criminals got released from jail. Those 3 criminals had a plot. The plot was to kill an ex-wife, to kill a father, to kidnap a father and a son, demand money, and then kidnap them and do away with their bodies. One of the 3 got cold feet and went to the state police. Captain Simpson was the troop commander on the desk at the time. Colonel McLeish tried to track down the father, the son, and the wife. He contacted all three. And he says, we are taking this very seriously. He said, I plan on having this guy in prison by nightfall. He sent two state troopers to Maryland to pick this guy up. One of the state troopers today is retired. He's a Subbaville town cop. His comment to me was, this guy doesn't need to get out of jail, because if he does, something bad is going to happen. Well, let me tell you, that son was my son. I was the father. I sat up on the witness stand and read a letter from the prosecuting attorney. When I was done reading that letter, I was asked, can you explain what this is? I said, yes. That is the directions to my house. What would have happened if that guy, if one of the three hadn't gotten cold feet? And I can tell you, and the state trooper will tell you that the rest of this guy, when this guy gets out of jail, without knowing that he is facing the death penalty, he will commit murder because he doesn't mind living in jail. Doesn't mind at all. He's been in there 2 different times. Folks, I'm asking you to keep this as a deterrent, and you'll never convince me that the death penalty is not. Because it could very well be me that this guy comes after. And believe me, I predict that if he does get out, and he's been up for parole twice already, if he does get out, he will kill his ex-wife if he doesn't have the death penalty as a deterrent. We have the best court system in the nation, some of the best judges. Why are we taking that out of their hands? And I'm asking you not to. When you put your family through the call that I got from our colonel of the state police, you don't want to take any chances. And I'm asking you, do not vote for SB 19. Thanks.
Senator Lawson.
And I just want to make it known that I don't tell this story. I don't like telling this story. And this is the first time I have even told this publicly. It hurts. And it's very scary. Especially when another one of the two is your son.
Senator Lawson.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just a few quick comments. First of all, Gerald, by what you said, one of them got cold feet. Was he deterred because of the death that he was going to cause? So the death penalty does deter crime. Prime example. In my years of law enforcement, I've seen some real animals, some absolute animals. Yes, they walk on 2 legs, but they are, without a doubt, animals. They don't care about human life. They don't care about their own lives. They just have a vengeance out there looking at us, looking at anyone that they can go after. Seen it too many times. The death penalty does deter in a lot of ways. 1, we just mentioned. 2, if the death penalty is carried out, they don't commit another crime. There is deterrent. We talk about the expenses and all. There's some conflicting numbers there, to say the least. But Senator Venables mentioned the Whaley case in Laurel, where the man savagely killed Mr. Whaley, then raped and killed his wife, and laid in wait for his sons to come home. But Kermit West got thirsty, so he went into Laurel and got drunk. He got locked up for being drunk. One of the sons comes home and finds this crime scene, finds his father brutally murdered, finds his mother upstairs brutally murdered, and ultimately found out raped. But laying in the bed beside her was a hat. The son recognized that hat as Kermit West's hat. And they put a lookout for Kermit, and there he is already in the jail. Kermit was given life
in jail. We didn't have the death penalty then. He went up for parole, and 9 times corrections recommended he be released, knowing full well that he was going to move back within the same neighborhood, within a mile of the crime and within a mile of the family that lived there, to do it again. Our system fails us miserably. We need to keep these animals in jail. We need to put these animals under the jail. Thank you.
Senator Petty John.
Thank you, Mr. President. Got a short story for you, and then I'm going to ask for a witness to come up. I was always listening to my parents and my grandparents talk, and they would say, do you remember? I know exactly what I was doing when. Usually it was when they heard that President Kennedy got shot, and I didn't realize. I never had anything that significant happen in my life until September 1st, 2009. I can tell you exactly what I was doing. We were getting ready for dinner, pork chop night, mashed potatoes, green beans on a red plate, getting ready to sit down at the dinner table. And I heard the town's fire whistle go off. For some reason, the hairs on the back of my neck stood straight up. I knew something was wrong. So I walked over and turned on the scanner, and I heard more commotion than I've ever heard in my entire life on police band. That was the night that Chad Spicer was shot by Derek Powell in Georgetown. I heard on the scanner 9083's down. And that's when I got in my truck and started going over toward that side of town. Met up with some town policemen, with a fire company, and started looking for the third person that had escaped the scene. I know that Ruth Ann Spicer was interviewed by the News Journal, asked her opinion on the death penalty. She wants to see Derek Powell put to death, and I'm happy to see that the amendment was put in. But what happens when the next Chad Spicer is killed? Because it's going to happen again. There's people out there on the street that have zero respect for law enforcement. They treat them just like they would treat a pest in their home. And I cannot stand that. These people are out there to protect our lives. And if they're going to take the life of one of our law enforcement officers, I can think of no greater, more deserving penalty than to put these animals to death. That's my statement on the issue, and I'd like to call, request personal privilege of the floor for Kathleen Jennings. She is the state prosecutor.
Privilege of the floor has been requested. Without objection, please identify yourself.
Thank you.
Thank you. Could you talk to us about proportionality, please?
Thank you, and good evening, Senators. I'm speaking on behalf of Attorney General Beau Biden as the state prosecutor, and he asks, he understands, we all understand that the issue of whether to repeal the death penalty involves morality, ethics, religion, and that you will all vote your consciences. We respect the process, and we respect what each of you has gone through in this analysis. We support the law as it is. We believe that the law reserves the death penalty, in fact, in the state of Delaware for the most heinous of criminal acts. It's hard to say there is murder and then there is murder. But let me highlight for you issues of proportionality, because it's an important consideration as you evaluate whether to repeal the death penalty. Stephen Pennell. I prosecuted Stephen Pennell for the serial killing of 5 women in the late 1980s. He abducted women off the street,
bound them with duct tape, their wrists, their ankles, took out pliers, proceeded to torture and mutilate these women as they lie there helplessly, not knowing whether they were going to live or die, and their pain only ending in their death when he took out a hammer and beat them over and over and over again on the head. There was nothing to stop Stephen Brian Pennell from this serial killing until he was arrested. He has been executed. David Dawson. David Dawson was incarcerated in Smyrna Prison. He escaped from Smyrna Prison and burglarized the home of Madeline Kissner. He bound her, gagged her, stabbed her 12 times. Dawson had 14 prior felony convictions, including, ladies and gentlemen, 3 previous escapes. Brian Steckel. Brian Steckel entered 29-year-old Sandra Lee Long's home. He beat her into unconsciousness, raped her, and set her on fire while she was still alive. After that, he contacted the media to announce who his next victim would be. During his trial, he sent a copy of Sandra Long's autopsy report to the victim's mother to taunt her. He has been executed. James Clark. James Clark was convicted of the premeditated murder of his adoptive parents, ages 71 and 72. They had adopted him when he was 4 months old. At 16, he was convicted for the kidnapping and attempted strangulation of a 3-year-old girl whom he had abducted from her backyard. He served 21 years for that offense, and during the time he was in prison, he assaulted a correctional officer and was convicted. 1 month after his release, he murdered his parents. He was executed. These are the most heinous, most egregious, most horrible murders for us to hear. We have heard them at length this afternoon and this evening. We have heard them from the heart, from the families of the victims. We have heard them from the senators who have their own personal stories to tell. The Attorney General asks you, in your consideration, in your deliberation as to whether to repeal the death penalty, where is the proportionality issue in your mind? Because there are murders that are committed on a moment's thought. A young 18-year-old man on the street has a gun and in a moment decides to shoot another young man. That's a bad act. That's a horrible act. And for that act, if he intended to kill that young man, there is a sentence, and it is called life sentence. But it does not compare to these cases. These are the most egregious, the most heinous. And do they deserve something different? The ultimate punishment. You will determine that with your vote. You will determine that with your vote. And I will say also that if we believe that by eliminating the death penalty that we will stop appeals, that we will stop post-conviction relief for years and years, and there will be a finality, we all know that that really is not finality. When I left the office 17 years ago now, I had, during my first tenure as a prosecutor, tried Glenn McDonald for murder. It was not a death penalty case. He was convicted of murdering a young lady because she had said she didn't want to be his girlfriend any longer. He strangled her and dumped her body off of Route 9. She was found several days later. He was convicted after a jury trial. I just attended his clemency hearing. So you have to ask yourself, is there a certainty that these individuals would receive a life sentence? Is there a certainty that life is life? Is there any relief from the endless appeals? That is not the issue. The issue is also not money. Because if you believe this is the correct punishment, then it's the correct punishment. If you don't believe it, then it's not. But it's not a matter of money. It's not a matter of the endless appeals. It's a matter of whether in your consciences you believe that the death penalty should stand.
Senator Pettyjohn.
If there are no other questions for the witness, I ask that she be excused.
Witness is excused.
Thank you.
Mr. President, as the members here have heard, we don't arbitrarily hand out the death sentence in Delaware. It is reserved for the worst of the worst. And it is a very difficult decision for a jury to make, for a family to make, to support the death penalty and the death of their loved one, and for the judge that hands down that sentence. I spoke to you for a couple minutes about Chad Spicer, and when Ms. Jennings was speaking, somebody that knows Chad all too well stepped into the chamber, and I would like to call Chief William Topping of the Georgetown Police Department as a witness.
Privilege of the floor has been requested. You can come forward, sir. Please identify yourself.
My name is Bill Topping. I'm the Chief of Police of the Town of Georgetown, Delaware. In September of 2009, Chad Spicer was killed in the line of duty. He left a small daughter behind. He left a loving family behind who we take care of to this very day, and we always shall. Myself and the family sat through the lengthy murder trial of Mr. Derek Powell. During that trial, we understood in testimony that Derek Powell had said, "Tonight I'm going to kill me a cop. If that cop tries to stop me, I'm going to kill me a cop." He did. He killed a young man, healthy young man, a man that had lived in Delaware and Sussex County his entire life. He played baseball, he played softball, he went to school at Sussex Central High School. He was a great man. He was a great kid to me, being as old as I am. I spoke with Ruth Ann and Norman Spicer. I have spoken with them on many occasions over the last 4 years. And Ruth Ann couldn't be here today, but she does not want this law repealed. She wants the death penalty for Derek Powell. She has stated to me that Derek Powell is able to receive visitors from his family in prison. He's able to see them. He's able to touch them. He's able to converse with them. They go to a gravesite. They take their Chad's young daughter, Aubrey, to a gravesite to visit her father. And that, to them, is inconceivable. They want justice. They don't want revenge. They want justice for the murder of their son. Justice that's guaranteed to them right now under the law. He was found guilty at the trial with irrefutable evidence by a jury of his peers. He was recommended for the death penalty, and Judge Graves gave him the death penalty. And I pray to see the day when that death penalty is executed. Thank you.
Senator Pettyjohn.
If there are no questions for the witness, I ask that he be excused.
Witness is excused.
Thank you.
Senator Peterson.
President, are there any other questions or comments?
Senator Marshall.
Thank you, Mr. President. Question for the sponsor of the bill, but I'd like to briefly make a comment. I've struggled with the issue for a long time. I've read, I've listened to people on both sides of the issue. Saturday, I had a lengthy meeting with parties on both sides of the issue. Sunday I had a conversation with a friend who happened originally to be from another country. We talked about the issue, and she expressed to me, and it was interesting, and it kind of weighed on my mind, and has had a significant influence on my likely decision here in a few minutes. She said that applied correctly, life in prison could be hell. I weighed that, talked with those that are interested in the issue. A few moments ago, I had a call from former Colonel Rob Coop, now the Corrections Commissioner. And I'd asked him because I've had some, you kind of research and you want to weigh because you hear the concerns of those who are convicted of murder in the first degree or sentenced to death, and you hear about the opportunity to go through the pardon or the clemency, and we go on through the red tape and subject families to that kind of additional victimization. And I have a question for Senator Peterson on that issue, but Colonel Coop gave me some good news in that when the governor recently delayed or what is the process where he lifted the death sentence? Commuted a death sentence, that in his order it required that this killer be guaranteed for the rest of his life being a resident of the SHU and under the conditions of 23-1. And the more I think about it, and I know Senator Lavelle and others, witnesses, have expressed their real life and human concerns and the impact of an experience. And it just seems to me that if the bill would leave the Senate today, and the House debated, or at some point the Corrections Commissioner has agreed, we need to find a way where the convicted of first-degree murder are not given as they are today. There's an opportunity where you can enter eventually on good behavior. Well, what a joke. When you're captive, you're likely to be on good behavior. And eventually, under the process, a convicted killer, convicted of first-degree murder, could end up in the general population. And I don't support that and don't believe that should be allowed to happen. But life in hell in the SHU under that 23-1 guaranteed for life living environment would probably in some cases, although the nature of the crimes are horrific, but could in some cases indeed be hell on earth for that individual. And I'm likely to support the bill as amended, but I needed to share that strong belief with the members here today and the public.
Senator McDowell.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, it's always difficult to contemplate the stories that we hear and we know are true. There are truly some horrible, horrible people extant today. And I can find no compassion. I have a lot of compassion. But I can find no compassion for those people who commit those horrible crimes that we have heard a lot about today. And it's not compassion for them that makes me rise. I agree that you could say they have forfeited their right to further existence. What I don't agree is we have a right to take that right. I would ask you to just think for a moment about Mr. Kirk Bloodsworth. Were he put to death by the state of Maryland, who would his parents and loved ones go and try to say, this is wrong, right it, give me revenge? Well, who would they go to?
state of Maryland, they do the killing. Most killers kill because of selfishness. There's something standing in their way for something they want, and they're willing to kill. They're willing to take another human being's life just to get it out of the way, get that problem going. Sometimes they do it in horrible fashion. We ask, before we give the ultimate punishment to those, we ask, I think, two questions. Maybe the prosecutors will correct me, there's more. But we ask, was it premeditated? Did they intend to do it? And we ask, were they of a right mind? Did they know right from wrong when they did it? Those two, then they qualify to be put to death. Maryland knew what they were doing. Nobody would say the state of Maryland's out of its mind, didn't know right from wrong. So I think that gives you at least pause. 2 times before, I've had to search my heart to vote on this issue. And it's not easy. It wasn't easy before. It's not easy this time. I've searched inside myself, and I found something that I didn't particularly like. I pride myself on knowing myself fairly well. And I know one of these beasts had committed some of the things that have been described today to my loved one. I probably would have to be restrained. I would go after them like a savage if not restrained, if not prevented. And I hope that somebody would be there to restrain me, to prevent me. But I know I could do that. Bare hands and all if I had. Hatfields and McCoys, a little bit of a joke, but they're true to their history. And they killed each other in chain fashion, because every time one of them killed another, they had to revenge it. They had to go kill to revenge it. Didn't solve the thing. Finally, though, a degree of civilization. And ultimately, they stopped that bloodshed. I'm asking that we stop our bloodshed. I'm asking that we find a better way. Civilization is sometimes described as a continuum of advancement of the human condition. I don't think we advance that human condition by solving our problem in the same way one of those beastly persons who killed somebody does, by killing, indeed. We have a responsibility to not mimic and thus perpetuate the murder scheme. There have been too many murders in this country, and I don't know why. I believe that I don't have the exact numbers, but since the end of the Vietnam War, we've killed more than died in that war. I don't mean, there have been more murders than people who died in that horrible war. Perhaps it's because we, the ultimate authorities, set the example that our solution is to kill. Therefore, it's okay. It's horrible logic, but I think it's partly there. In any case, I believe we have a responsibility to rise above it.
Senator Townsend.
Thank you, Mr. President. It's been nothing short of a soul-searching few weeks since I knew this issue would be addressed by the State Senate. I respectfully disagree with Senator McDowell about whether or not the state has a right to take a life. And I don't find it particularly compelling, the idea that there's some sort of fatal irony in punishing a killer by killing. I think it's one thing to take an innocent life. I think it's a very different thing for a group of men and women to come together and to vote in democracy for a penal system that includes capital punishment. But simply because the state may have the right to enact such a punishment does not necessarily mean that it should exercise that right. Senator Lavelle's question regarding certain autocracies in the world and the comparison between the United States or between Delaware and those autocracies, and his comment about the offensiveness of that analogy, I thought was interesting. Although I'm not quite sure what is worse, an autocracy that puts its citizens to death or a democracy that puts its citizens to death. I very much appreciate Senator Marshall's comments about the kinds of conditions in which people on death row currently live and the kinds of conditions in which we might be able to ensure that they live. I wholeheartedly embrace the idea of taking a long, hard look at those conditions, and as a state, determining what we can do up to the point of violating the Eighth Amendment of cruel and unusual punishment to ensure that people who have acted in the way that these men have acted do not enjoy some of the luxuries that have been talked about today, and I think in some cases just presumed today. I don't know what it's like to be a death row inmate right now in Delaware. The closest I could come to finding that out in the past few weeks of my soul searching was visiting Mr. Gaddis at the Vaughn Correctional Center. I had hoped to speak with a current death row inmate, but because they were all appealing their cases, I was told that that was not possible. So I spoke with a person whose sentence was recently commuted by Governor Markell. And standing there in the prison, separated by several inches of glass, having walked through several gates, several doors, having realized the kinds of conditions in which he is living, I did take some heart in the fact that his life did not seem to be as comfortable as many people might assume that a death row inmate's life is. And I fully agree with Senator Marshall that we should explore what certain kinds of conditions might make the most sense under which we should house men and perhaps women who commit the kinds of crimes that currently we deem to be deserving of capital punishment. But perhaps the greatest part of the soul searching in the past few weeks has been when I learned that, formally at least, many of the Delaware law enforcement agencies and groups are opposing repeal of the death penalty. And that is because my father served as a police officer in the city of Newark for 30 years. And when I learned that they all stood in opposition, formally, I felt an immediate sense of confusion about who I am and my identity and what it means for me to consider myself very fortunate to be part of a family that is a member of the police fraternity, yet for my name to be listed as a co-sponsor of the bill. And I was confused for what reasons the national chiefs of police might support repeal, but the Delaware agencies oppose it. I took heart quickly in the idea that maybe I could support an amendment that would make an exception for law enforcement. And then I thought perhaps the amendment should include firefighters. Perhaps the amendment should include first responders. Perhaps the amendment should include anyone who is officially acting in a capacity as an arm of the state. And my initial thoughts were very similar to Senator Pettyjohn's comment about what could be more deserving than the animalistic act of killing a police officer who's acting on behalf of the state to protect us. And I found my answer by talking to the police officer closest to me, my father. Perhaps one of the few times in life I've agreed with him. And he said, police officer puts on his badge or her badge, puts on his gun or her gun, kisses loved ones, and goes out, knowing full well that he or she has made an adult decision to take a risk, to put his or her life on the line in service to the community. What sense does it make to craft an exception for the death penalty for the killing of a police officer who made a calculated risk in service to his or her community, but not to make an exception for the truly innocent loss of life, such as a 7-year-old who's walking on the wrong street corner, or a 7-year-old who's sitting in an elementary school classroom when a gunman bursts through the door? I understand that we've heard testimony from families' victims, some who support the death penalty and some who oppose, and I'm not quite sure how to make sense out of that. And I certainly share Senator McDowell's statement about how enraged I would feel if I walked home and saw my loved one a victim of a heinous crime. But between the soul searching and the various information that I have attempted to look very closely at and discern, it seems to me that our current system, as structured, does cost far more than it should to enact a punishment that in many ways I am not morally opposed to. And that the way in which our system is currently structured ensures that for 20 years or 15 years or too long a period of time, the focus of the tragic loss of life is not on the victims, but on the killers. And I believe there are things that we can do and should do to change that. I believe Senate Bill 19 is a step in that direction. It is not the entirety of reaching that goal. But I do think that it's important, as we struggle with such fundamental questions of society and civilization, that as we talk about whether the death penalty does or does not deter murderers and what it does to protect police, I think it's important for us to be as candid as possible and as truthful as possible in understanding that there are far better ways for us to protect the police. I hope that any cost savings achieved by repeal of the death penalty are directed towards police services, victim services. I believe we should never stand in front of police officers at a press conference if the bill does not truly relate to improving the lives and safety of police. I believe that we should do our best when we see an economic downturn coming to actually increase funding for police in anticipation of the increased crime that is certainly to follow. And I understand that some of those things of which I just spoke are not related to Senate Bill 19. But I also vote yes for Senate Bill 19, knowing full well that I intend to pursue those ends. And again, it has been a period of soul searching. I don't know what it's like to be the family of the police officers in Delaware who have tragically fallen in the past few years, Spicer and Zerba. I'm one of the lucky many, whose parents served honorably as a police officer, and he or she came home every night. I vote yes for this, fully aware that my experience in a police family is different than some others in Delaware. But that difference does not enable me to overcome what I believe to be a flawed public policy and a very serious need for us to come together and change that flawed policy. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Venables.
Thank you, Mr. President. We came very close today, and maybe yesterday, that the 17 people that's on death row sentence would have been changed to life in prison. Only because other states did not include that in their changing the death penalty is why we did that. And I had a question that I don't think I got the right answer on. If a General Assembly, which we are, has liberals and conservatives, as you want to call it that say that we should do away with the death penalty, We have some that say that we shouldn't. What's to say that in the future, if this bill passes, which we had the power, unless the governor vetoed it, to commute their sentence, and we come close to doing that because they had the votes. I bet 20 years from now or 30 years from now that some of these people that committed these atrocities, terrible crime, heinous word, that another General Assembly shows more compassion and say, well, these are model prisoners now. They found Christ. They're religious now. Why shouldn't we take that in consideration of this good behavior, and now they're Christians? Maybe let them apply for parole. And I would like someone, that knows the law and how much power this General Assembly's got, whether that could happen or not. And I don't know whether Steve Wood could answer that or not. I don't know whether he's still in the chamber.
Did you want to call him as a witness, sir?
I'd like to call him as a witness because I'd like to have that answer.
Privilege of the floor has been requested for Mr. Wood. Without objection, you could please identify yourself, sir.
Stephen Wood, Attorney General's Office, Senator.
And Steve, did you hear my question?
As I understood it, Senator, the question was whether the General Assembly would have it within its authority to commute the sentences of people on death row. Was that
change their sentence to allow them to seek parole?
Point of information, or point of order, rather, Mr. President. We've already removed that from the bill. That issue is not before us.
I think it's very important to the bill that we think, that these people that we're saying will be put in prison for the rest of their life, that another General Assembly could change that.
I think that I appreciate the clarification about the amendment. I think the question is appropriate.
I know the amendment was put on, but it come awful close to being enacted.
Senator, the General Assembly has the authority to retroactively decrease any sentence that is currently being served by a person convicted of a crime. So, hypothetically, if this is your question, if I understand it correctly, a General Assembly of the future could turn around and say that a person serving a life sentence for first-degree murder will now be serving a sentence of less than life. In fact, my return to the General Assembly and your service last week was to testify in favor of a bill motivated, of course, by the United States Supreme Court's decision, but that did exactly that. We told you back in the 1980s that your sentence was life without parole, but it's not anymore. It's now parolable, and some of those inmates will eventually be released. So we saw an example of that just last week.
Well, it is a concern of mine because, one time we had the death penalty, then we took it off, and then nobody put it on, and now we're taking it off, and we're saying life in prison, and then there is a chance that another General Assembly could say, well, now we decided they're eligible for parole. Thank you.
Other questions for the witness? Senator Marshall for the witness.
President, thank you. Mr. Wood, we've talked about the issue of should the bill be enacted, signed by the governor, there'd be a cost savings and money available. My idea would be that if the bill were enacted, signed by the governor, that we would guarantee that that money go to construction of another shoe or whatever is necessary in order to guarantee that 23-in-1 program. Do we need, if this bill were to be signed by the governor in its present form, let me back up. Could the House amend it in any way that could guarantee that certain sentences would guarantee that criminal be placed in the shoe and a 23-to-1 concept for the rest of their life? And it goes back to the life in hell that we will guarantee. And if it takes action by the General Assembly, then the bill would move out of here. In your legal opinion, do we need to amend it, or can we do a follow-up bill?
Senator, as you pointed
I know
out,
I'm placing you on the other side of the issue, that in the event it ends up being law and signed by the governor.
Senator, I'm bidden to answer your questions about the law accurately, and I'll do so to the extent I can. As you pointed out in your earlier remarks, in general, the Department of Correction has authority to house an inmate serving a sentence wherever the department believes that sentence is best served. Inmates who are on, there is no such thing as death row. We have what's called the Special Housing Unit, or the SHU, which is, as you have noted, a facility where inmates are housed for 23 hours in solitary confinement. In 1 hour they're given exercise. Inmates serving death sentences are there. Most inmates serving life sentences for first-degree murder are not there. They're in general population. Does the General Assembly have the authority to change that? Yes, Senator. There's a provision in the Delaware Code now, which is rarely used, that gives our sentencing judges the authority to order that an inmate serve up to 3 months of any sentence in solitary confinement. Now, obviously, that's much less than life, but we see in that provision of the existing code the fact that the General Assembly for decades and decades and decades has taken unto itself the authority to determine the conditions of housing. So if were the House to pass such an amendment and this body to pass it, it would absolutely be lawful.
Thank you.
Senator McDowell for the witness.
Yes, thank you, Mr. President. Steve, your answer, whereas it was not ruled out of order, the question wasn't ruled out of order, but it's at least moot. Your answer would not differ on the issue of whether a future General Assembly could affect the people that are on death row, whether the bill today that's before us at this moment passes or whether it doesn't pass. Your answer would be the same, correct?
Absolutely, Senator, yes.
Moot point.
Other questions for the witness? Senator Venables for the witness.
Well, I guess maybe my hearing aid or something didn't work. I didn't understand what he asked. And then he said, what I asked is mute. Is that what he said?
Why don't we, I don't want to have Mr. Wood interpret what Senator McDowell said. Why don't
because I understood you to say, when I asked the question, that a future General Assembly could change the death sentence with life in prison without a parole, the same as we were going to do before the amendment was put on, that we were going to commute their sentence to life in prison instead of execution. And he said that's mute now. I didn't understand that.
Senator, my answer to your question, as I understood it, was yes, the General Assembly can change sentences afterwards. And I believe that my answer to Senator McDowell's question was yes. And
what was his question?
Not, I take it that the President agrees that it's not my place to decide whether your question is moot, or I was just trying to answer the state of the law as both senators asked the question.
Well, I have trouble understanding what he's saying, so I don't know what the question was.
I don't want to again put Mr. Wood in the middle. Why don't we, if there are other questions for him, and then you and Senator McDowell could.
Mr. President, point of order.
Yes.
Point of order. I think I made a very clear point. I asked the witness if his answer would be exactly the same whether the bill that is before us at this moment passed or whether it did not pass. It would be the exact same answer.
I'm not sure that's a point of order, Senator, but again, why don't we see if there's
Well, it's a point of clarification, let's go.
Are there any other questions for the witness? Senator Lawson for the witness. You have a question for the witness, sir?
Yes, I do. Thank you. Down the road, we no longer have a life sentence. Could it be argued that spending 40 years in a 9x19 cell would be cruel and unusual punishment?
Boy, Senator, with all due respect, whenever you ask a lawyer, is it possible, I suppose the answer is almost always yes. I don't mean that to be entirely humorous. I wouldn't have guessed, for instance, 30 years ago that the United States Supreme Court would have said, as it recently said, that a juvenile cannot be sentenced to life without parole. I wouldn't have seen that coming. It's so hard, certainly with my limited understanding of these things, to look that far ahead. But sure, the United States Supreme Court could say that, hypothetically, I suppose.
But within this assembly, I mean, within the court system, within this state is what I'm concerned with.
I suppose it's possible, yes.
So these people who are convicted today, given life, if this bill passes, then could somewhere down the road be released?
Well, I think as both Senator McDowell and Senator Venables pointed out in separate questions, future General Assemblies can change the law. That's true. The only constitutional prohibition is not to find a point on it, is you can't make things worse. You can't increase the punishment, but you can always decrease it. That's true. And future Supreme Courts, be they the Supreme Courts of Delaware or the United States, can decide that the Eighth Amendment prohibits something that it does not prohibit today. That's true.
Thank you, sir. So these people could ultimately be released. Thank you.
Senator Townsend for the witness.
Yes, thank you, Mr. President. It's more, I think, just 2 points of clarification. I'm not sure if it's the attorney in me or the senator in me who understands how important a debate this is. I want to make sure that the framework is correct. I believe Senator Lawson said unintentionally and erroneously that because life is no longer a sentence. I think what he meant to say is if we repeal capital punishment, so if the death penalty is no longer a sentence, then sometime in the future might housing inmates in a certain kind of condition constitute cruel and unusual punishment. Is that what you understood his question to be? If we end the death penalty?
I suppose, Senator, if you'll forgive me, I'm not trying to duck your question, but I think the answer to the question is the same. It's the same answer, essentially, that I gave to Senator McDowell and to Senator Venables, which is that a future General Assembly can change the rules.
Understood. I just want to be very clear that we're not taking life off the table. And also a point of clarification, Mr. Wood, if you could confirm, you said you wouldn't have imagined 30 years ago the Supreme Court would say that juveniles cannot be sentenced to life without parole.
Yes.
Is that what they have said, or that it can no longer be mandatory?
Thank you, Senator. The United States Supreme Court said that juveniles cannot be sentenced to a mandatory sentence of life without parole. And I wouldn't have imagined that 30 years ago, but that might just simply be a comment on my own inability to see things coming.
Understood. Just wanted to revisit our conversation from a week ago. Or so.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
Other questions for the witness? Senator Venables.
If there's not, I'd ask the witness to be excused.
Witness is excused. Senator Marshall.
President, I request the personal privilege of the floor for the public defender.
Without objection. You can please identify yourself, sir.
Good evening, Mr. President, Senators. My name is Brendan O'Neill. I'm the public defender for Delaware.
Senator Marshall.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. O'Neill, we had a brief conversation, and I voiced my concern publicly. I've had a conversation with Commissioner Coop regarding a conviction of first-degree murder that under the bill where the death penalty would be revoked, but could there be I know that there can be a sentence guaranteeing the shoe concept in the 23-1 program for the life of that inmate. Would you fight that and feel uncomfortable?
It's a question that's difficult for me to answer in the abstract. I think when we had a brief discussion about this, my response at that time was my immediate concern tonight is to repeal the death penalty. And at this moment in time, I'm not really personally concerned about what the Department of Correction does with them after they are sentenced to life. But that's in the abstract. If we did repeal the death penalty, and if a person is sentenced to life without parole and is kept in conditions that are cruel and unusual under our Constitution, I will raise the issue and it will be up for a court to decide. I cannot stand here and say, I don't care what the conditions of incarceration are, do to these people whatever you choose to do, Commissioner of Correction. Even people who are sentenced to life without parole retain certain constitutional rights, and I think it may be hell, but you can only give them so much hell. You have to observe the certain human, you have to respect their dignity, even though they didn't respect anyone else's dignity when they were free. We can't just lock them in a cage and make them walk on hot coals.
Mr. President, at this point in time, I respectfully disagree. We've heard the nature of some of the crimes committed, convictions, ruling by the jury and the judge. Why would you, in the human experience, I mean, is it your job title and you view your professional purpose in life that you would need to take that position? It would seem to me that if we passed a bill and guaranteed life in the shoe in the 23-and-1 program, that you would abide by that. But you feel compelled to fight it. And
no, I didn't say I would fight it in the abstract, and that's how it's now presented to me.
Mr. President, it's not in the abstract. You've heard of cases, and we have individuals that are on death row. Now they've been exempted, but there are others. Do you feel professionally and personally, morally obligated to fight their fight and get them into the general population and let them enjoy the gym and colored television and some level?
Personally, I don't have a stake in it. Professionally, it is my obligation as the appointed public defender to make sure that the people who are sentenced by our court system are treated in a way that is consistent with our Constitution, that they retain certain minimal rights. And the rights are minimal. But I don't think as a community, as a state, we can just say, once they get in there, they no longer have any rights whatsoever. As a society, we have an obligation to treat them humanely. And what constitutes humane treatment is a matter for a court to decide.
So
I can't tell you here that I would or would not pursue a lawsuit on behalf of an inmate. And typically my office does not address those issues. Once a person's sentence has been imposed and conviction affirmed following an appeal, typically we are not involved in any of that litigation. But professionally, there is, I don't think we can abandon our obligation to treat inmates in a humane way. It doesn't make it nice, it doesn't make it fun, it doesn't make it comfortable. But that's going to be ultimately for a court to decide and put what limits on the circumstances and the conditions of a person's incarceration.
Okay, so that, I mean, we're talking about a very narrow, small population. And upon the order of the judge or some action by the General Assembly that the judge and jury act on and order, you would feel comfortable with that. I mean,
well, I certainly prefer that to having a death penalty.
Thank you.
Senator Peterson, did you have a question for the witness? I thought I saw you saying Senator Townsend.
Thank you, Mr. President. I don't want to belabor the point, but obviously Senator Marshall has a strong feeling and focus on this. And let me pose the question to you this way. To your knowledge, are the conditions under which Mr. Gaddis is currently held considered cruel and unusual punishment?
To my knowledge, they are not considered cruel and unusual.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Other questions for the witness? Senator Marshall, do you want to excuse the witness? Witness is excused. Thank you. Senator Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. President. This has been an issue that I've soul searched over for the last at least 40 years in my life. And there's certainly been a lot of eloquent testimony here this afternoon, both sides. I certainly have sympathy and empathy for the families of the victims that are here today. I can't imagine what you're going through. And I know that, like Senator Marshall, that if it were one of my own family, I would feel the way you do, that justice is served by death. We've heard issues back and forth on the economic condition of the prisoners or of the defendants. bias, the cost, deterrence. But it all boils down to me on two issues. One is innocence. We know that our system is not 100% accurate. We know that. We can say that Delaware's never made a mistake, but how do we really know? We don't really know. We know other states that have found their mistakes and stopped executions in most cases. But we are human. This is government. You heard Mr. Bloodsworth say that there was 5 witnesses that testified that he was the one that committed the murder. 2 juries felt that he had been rightly convicted. 2 judges. But he was found innocent. You saw how big he was. The guy that was ultimately found guilty of the crime was 5'6" and weighed 140 pounds. Big difference between what you see in Kirk Bloodsworth. So unless we can say that we are 100% sure that we're convicting the right person, I don't see how we can take that chance. How many does it take for us to be wrong before we change our mind and say no more to the death penalty? But the ultimate question for me comes down to morality. Mr. O'Neill spoke to it very eloquently last week in testimony before the executive committee. That's my final line, is my own morality. I know some of yours is different, and you don't have that qualm. But I just don't feel that I have the right to take someone else's life. And even though it's taken in the name of the state, I'm the one that's voting for it today. I'm the one that's saying that person deserves to die. And if you can make that determination for yourself, that's your opinion and that's your belief system, and I don't hold that against you. But that's mine, and that's where I fall out on this issue. Thank you.
Mr. Hawker.
You just heard the word innocent. I can tell you my son and I were innocent. And what you put families through, nobody knows what my family would have been through if it wasn't for that deterrent on that guy that got cold feet, went to the state police to stop that. We're taking that away if we pass SB 19. I can tell you I was innocent. My son was innocent. The guy's wife was innocent. And thank God for the deterrent of the death penalty. No family had to go through what you heard other families had to go through here. And why take that away from our court system and our judge? You heard murder is murder. There's different types of murder. What we heard here today. Everything is different. It needs to be handled differently. It needs to be sentenced differently. And you can't do that by taking that power away from our court system. Thanks.
Senator Peterson.
Mr. President, if there are no other comments or questions, I will proceed with my closing remarks. First, Mr. President, I would like to respond to a couple of statements that were made, only to make sure the record is correct on these issues, because there have been some statements. We heard testimony that there are no racial disparities in Delaware in sentencing, in handing down the death penalty. And I would just, for the record, like to say that the Cornell University study showed that black defendants who kill white victims are 7 times as likely to receive the death penalty as are black defendants who kill black victims. So I just wanted that on the record. As to whether or not the death penalty serves as a deterrent, Mr. Wood was correct. There were 12 studies that say it is a deterrent, and there are also 12 studies that say that it is not a deterrent. However, the National Academy of Sciences looked at all of those studies, and they concluded that the evidence is inconclusive. And I'd like to read what the National Academy of Sciences wrote about it so that we can give it its appropriate weight here today. It said the committee concludes that research to date on the effect of capital punishment on homicide is not informative about whether capital punishment decreases, increases, or has no effect on homicide rates. Therefore, the committee recommends that these studies not be used to inform deliberations requiring judgments about the effect of the death penalty on homicide. That's from the National Academy of Sciences. Mr. Wood also talked about Red Dog and said that if Red Dog had been executed, he couldn't have killed again. Well, I'd like to say that if the federal government hadn't released Red Dog to Delaware in a witness protection program, he wouldn't have killed again either. One of the witnesses asked, if it's not broke, why fix it? Well, it is broke. It's badly broken, the death penalty. We execute innocent people. We know that there is a racial component to it. Even the United States Supreme Court admitted that. We know that it's expensive. Basically, we know that it doesn't work. It doesn't work. Only 1% of all murderers in this country get the death penalty. Only 1%. 99% don't. In fact, we've been talking about housing here in Delaware prisons. Do you realize that we already have 243 convicted first-degree murder convicts serving life without parole in Delaware prisons? 243 we already have in our prison. First-degree murder, life without parole. So this is not something completely unheard of or unique. As to the deterrent effect, we know that they said 99% don't get the death penalty, and for the 1% that do get it for murder, only 1% of them are executed. So your chances of getting the death penalty are pretty minuscule in this country. We know that the states, the 8 states with the highest murder rates, also have death penalty statutes, and the states in this nation with no death penalty have the lowest murder rates. So there's no correlation between them. Kathy Jennings spoke about proportionality, and she talked about the Stephen Pennell case and David Dawson and Brian Steckel. They were all horrible cases. Really, there's anybody in this room who would disagree that they are horrible cases. But I do disagree that we save the death penalty for the worst of the worst. Certainly, any time a person loses a family member in a murder, that is the worst of the worst for that family. I don't know how we measure them, but if we could measure the worst of the worst, then how do we explain the Donald Flagg case, the Puglisi murder? He did not get the death penalty, and I can't think of a more horrific crime than what Donald Flagg did to the Puglisi family. Or Linda Lou Charbonneau, who killed not only one but 2 husbands, burying the second one in her backyard alive. I can't think of anything worse than being buried alive. But here in Delaware, they did not get the death penalty. So I don't know how we can say we save it for the worst of the worst, because those 2 would be at the top of my list as to the worst of the worst. Finally, Mr. President, we know that the death penalty doesn't deter crime. 88% of criminologists agree with that. And 57% of police officers who were polled also agreed that the death penalty does not deter violent crime. We know that it's not enforced uniformly or equally. If you're white and rich, chances are you won't get it. But if you're poor and black or mentally ill, your chances of getting it are far greater. We know that innocent people are sometimes sentenced to death. We know that it costs 2 to 3 times more than life in prison without parole. And we know that many victims' families do not get any closure from the execution of their loved one's killer. You know, every public policy is supposed to have a purpose, a clearly defined public purpose. When we pour millions of dollars into education, we know it's because we're trying to educate our children. When we pour millions of dollars every year into transportation, we know that we're trying to fix our roads and our bridges and provide public transportation. But if you were to ask 5 people what the public purpose is of the death penalty, you'll probably get 5 different answers. I've heard all of them. Some say an eye for an eye. completely disregarding the New Testament. Others will say some people are so evil they just deserve to die. Or it's cheaper to kill them than keep them alive. Or to keep them from escaping and killing again. Some say to show them we're tough on crime, and others say to teach them that killing is wrong, which is my personal favorite. We kill to teach them that killing is wrong. The only thing I've learned about this particular public policy is that nobody seems to know what the point of it is. Despite that, we keep doing it and spending millions of dollars every year. And that's money that could be spent on policies that actually reduce crimes and make our communities safe. And aside from spending millions of dollars on failed public policy, we also run the risk of sentencing innocent people to death. Kirk Bloodsworth could have been one of those people, had his own lawyer not paid $10,000 for the DNA testing out of his own pocket. It wasn't the state of Maryland that freed Mr. Bloodsworth. It was his own attorney who believed so strongly in his innocence who paid for the DNA testing. And as he said, if it could happen to him, it could happen to anybody. And yes, it has happened in Delaware. There were two recent cases involving one man who spent 20 years on death row in Delaware. And that case was overturned. The conviction was overturned and the sentence was overturned. And just the one last week, who had already been tried for murder once, and had it not been for a hung jury, could very well have been on death row right now. But instead, he's free now. Finally, Mr. President, in closing, I'd like to just add one thing, and this goes to the heart of why I sponsored this bill. And this is something very personal. I don't usually get up and talk about my own personal beliefs, spiritual beliefs, but you don't introduce a bill like this knowing that you're going to incur the wrath of various groups and certain interests unless you really, really believe in it. This week is Holy Week in Christian churches across Delaware and around the world. It's the most sacred and solemn week on the liturgical calendar. And this is the week that we recall the last days of Jesus Christ. And as we read the scriptures this week during Holy Week, there's one passage that kind of has always bothered me since I was a little kid and first heard it. And that's the passage where Jesus is arrested and he's taken before Pontius Pilate. Now, Jesus technically committed what would they consider the capital crime in those days, was blasphemy. He was taken before Pontius Pilate, and Pilate didn't really want to order him to be executed. But the throngs of people who were there did. They did want Pilate to execute him. And so when Pilate said to them, "What would you have me do with him?" the throngs hollered, "Crucify him, crucify him." And finally Pilate threw his hands up and said, "As you will." And they took Jesus away to be executed. But Scripture tells us that Pontius Pilate did one more thing before that. He took a bowl of water and he washed his hands. And he said, "I wash my hands of all responsibility for this man's death. I wash my hands of his blood." You know, Mr. President, when an inmate is executed in the state of Delaware, the medical examiner's office has to fill out a death certificate. And that death certificate, under manner of death, the medical examiner writes homicide. Homicide. That's what's written on death certificates when we execute people. And it is homicide. And it is wrong, Mr. President. And we have a choice before us. We can either do what Pontius Pilate did and wash our hands and say we take no responsibility for their deaths, or we can put an end to it in Delaware today. I ask for the roll call.
Secretary, could you please call the roll on Senate Bill number 19 as amended?
Senator Blevins? Yes. Senator Bonini? Senator Bonini from absent to mark present and voting no. Senator Bushweller? Yes. Senator Cloutier? Yes. Senator Ennis? No. Senator Hollong? No. Senator Henry? Yes. Senator Hocker? No. Senator Lavelle? No. Senator Lawson? No. Senator Lopez?
Yes.
Yes. Senator Marshall?
Yes.
Yes. Senator McBride? No. Senator McDowell? Yes. Senator Peterson? Yes. Senator Pettyjohn? No. Senator Poore? No. Senator Simpson? Yes. Senator Sokola? Yes. Senator Townsend? Yes. Senator Venables? No. Mr. President, the roll call on Senate Bill number 19 as amended by Senate Amendment number 1, 11 yes and 10 no.
Having received its required majority vote, Senate Bill number 19 is amended as passed the Senate. Senator McBride.
Mr. President,